The last broadcast from Auckland came through at 3:47 in the morning, and then there was nothing. Callum Marsh heard it from the break room at the Hartley Borough Council offices, where he'd been sleeping on the couch again because his landlord had finally changed the locks. The radio had been doing its usual insomniac murmur in the background, some overnight presenter cycling through weather updates and dedications, and then mid-sentence, mid-word, a sound like every frequency collapsing into one in silence, not static. Not a technical fault, the specific, particular silence of a signal that had simply ceased to exist. He sat up. He looked at the radio. He looked at his phone, which had no bars, and then, while he watched, no icons at all, just a blank gray field where the carrier name used to be. Outside, through the smeared double glazing of the ground floor window, he could see the car park. 3 vehicles. A skip full of old planning documents that had been sitting there since June. The sodium lamp that always flickered. Overhead, the sky was the wrong color. Not wrong in any specific articulable way, just wrong. Like someone had dialed the blue down 2 notches and then left the room. He made himself a cup of tea. That was the first thing. He'd learned that from his mom, who had operated on the principle that no situation, no matter how severe, was unimproved by the act of putting the kettle on. It didn't solve anything. It didn't pretend to solve anything. It just gave your hands something to do, while your brain caught up with whatever your hands already knew. By the time his tea was ready, the ships were visible. They came from the east, out of a sky that had gone from wrong to genuinely, irrevocably strange, a deep violet amber at the horizon like a bruise healing in reverse. There were 11 of them. He counted. He would always remember that, 11. They were enormous in the way that mountains are enormous, the kind of enormous that the brain simply refused to process at first, filing them under clouds or geography until sheer persistent scale demanded reclassification. They moved at about the speed of unhurried thought, without sound, without the faintest vibration of displaced air, without the drama that every film he'd ever seen had led him to expect. No beam weapons, no explosion of atmosphere. They simply moved, and then they stopped, and then they sat over the town center as if they had always been there. And the rest of the preceding history of the universe had been the anomaly. Callum drank his tea. He waited. He went to his desk and opened the planning applications he was supposed to have processed by end of the previous week. A proposed rear extension on a Victorian terrace on Linwood Road. A change of use application for a disused laundrette on Park Street. A loft conversion with dormer window that was going to be a problem because the ridge height exceeded permitted development limits by 9 centimeters. He looked at these documents for approximately 3 minutes, then closed them and went back to the window. The ships hadn't moved. On the 3rd morning, they sent down a communication. Not a broadcast signal, not a radio transmission. They projected it directly onto the cloud layer over every major population center simultaneously, in every language they had apparently taken 6 weeks to learn. A list of 37 requirements for the transition to what they called integrated compliance status. The list was extraordinarily bureaucratic. Point 8 concerned the registration of all agricultural land holdings with a designated administrative officer. Point 14 concerned the proper disposal of organic waste materials. Point 21 required that all public gathering spaces be registered within 90 days. Point 29 was about queuing and was the point that most people on social media were either making jokes about or expressing what Callum privately thought was entirely justified. Outrage, because the queuing point wasn't about efficiency, it was about the specific form of the queue, which was to follow Vern custom rather than the existing informal but well-understood human tradition. And this was clearly a statement about whose cultural norms were going to be considered default. The species called themselves the Vern. They had been monitoring Earth for 218 of its years. Their home system was failing, their sun in a slow decline that would render their world uninhabitable within 4 generations, and they had spent 2 centuries mapping potential alternatives and finding them one by one insufficient. Earth was sufficient. It was more than sufficient. They needed it. They emphasized repeatedly and with what appeared to be genuine sincerity, here to harm anyone. They simply intended to live here now. They had chosen what they believed to be a measured and humane approach, administrative integration rather than destruction. The paperwork, they acknowledged, was considerable, but they had experience with paperwork, and they trusted the process. The Prime Minister released a statement that was, under the circumstances, considerably more coherent than it might have been. Then she resigned. Then the Deputy Prime Minister released a statement and also resigned. The leader of the opposition said several things that were reported extensively, and then, 3 days later, quietly deleted from his social media accounts. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued a pastoral letter. Several prominent scientists appeared on television and explained, with varying degrees of emotional control, what was happening. The internet continued to function in a degraded state. The Verne had found human data infrastructure confusing in ways they had not anticipated and had accidentally rerouted 40% of European traffic through a server cluster in Estonia that they had mistaken for a centralized communications hub because of its significant heat signature. Into this gap, because someone had to fill it, stepped Callum Marsh. He hadn't volunteered precisely, he'd simply been present. The Verne had designated the Hartley Borough Council offices as their regional administrative center for reasons that were, when they were eventually explained, more comprehensible than anyone had initially assumed. The building was a perfect square which they considered architecturally indicative of serious governmental intent. It sat at what they had calculated as the precise geographical midpoint of the nation, which was incorrect. This was because they had made their calculation using the centroid of the landmass rather than the population-weighted center, a methodological choice that Callum had attempted to explain and then given up on explaining. And their preliminary survey had identified the building as having the highest ratio of filing cabinets to floor space of any public building in the region, which they interpreted as evidence of significant administrative capability and bureaucratic seriousness. And on this last point they were, Callum privately acknowledged, not entirely wrong. Callum was the only council employee who had not, in the 6 weeks since the ships arrived, either fled the town, been evacuated to whatever undisclosed location the government was currently operating from, or simply not come back one morning without explanation. He was there partly from stubbornness, partly from uncertainty about where else to go, partly because the couch in the break room was genuinely very comfortable, and partly because of a quality he possessed that he did not himself have a name for, but which manifested as an inability to walk away from a situation that still had the possibility of being managed. His job until 6 weeks ago had been processing planning applications for minor residential extensions and loft conversions, a role he had occupied with quiet competence and zero ambition for 7 years. He was 31 years old. He had a shelf of novels he kept meaning to read, a coffee mug with a chip in it that he refused to throw away on the grounds that it was still functional, and a very specific and detailed knowledge of local building regulations that was now, as far as he could tell, entirely irrelevant. When the Verne delegation first descended from the ship above the car park and entered the building through the front doors, which they examined at length because automated sliding doors presented, philosophically, a category problem they had not anticipated, specifically the question of whether a door that opened on approach constituted an invitation or a mechanical function, and whether the distinction mattered, and if so, to whom. They found Callum at the front desk. He had shaved. He was wearing his work lanyard. On the desk beside him was a cup of tea and a second empty cup. "Welcome," he said. "I've made tea. I wasn't sure how you take it, so I've left it black. There's milk in the fridge if you'd like it." The 3 senior Verne representatives stood in the reception area and regarded him. Trail was tall and moved like someone perpetually carrying something slightly too heavy. Not burdened, exactly, but weighted, as if all her decisions had mass and she felt them. Goran was compact and exuded the specific energy of a middle manager who had never once, in his entire professional career, been told he was wrong about anything significant. The third had adopted the name Briggs because they had overheard Callum say it to someone on his phone and assumed it was a title of address. They had not been disabused of this assumption because Callum had not had the energy, in the first week, to explain British surnames. "You are the designated liaison?" Trail asked, in English that was grammatically precise and somehow also slightly too precise, like a translation that had been run through a dictionary 3 times and then read aloud by someone who understood each word individually but was still calibrating their feel for sequence. "I appear to be," Callum said. "Tea? That was how it began." The first week was almost entirely orientation. The Verne had extensive documentation about Earth's administrative systems, compiled from 200 years of remote observation, but their understanding of how things actually functioned was filtered through the lens of a species that had never, in its entire recorded history, done anything without proper authorization forms in triplicate, and had therefore naturally assumed that this was how everything worked. They understood, in theory, the concept of a prime minister. They had not been prepared for the reality that this individual also had to take questions from journalists on a twice-weekly basis and that some of those journalists would ask whether she had personally considered surrendering to the aliens in exchange for personal immunity, and that the answer to this question was both nationally televised and available on the internet forever. They had not fully accounted for the internet. They had accounted for formal broadcast infrastructure, television, radio, official government communications channels. The concept of a thing called social media, through which any individual human could publicly issue any opinion about absolutely anything to absolutely anyone without vetting, authorization, or consequence, had caused what Trail described as significant recalibration of our projections. They are saying, Trail told Callum on the fourth day, holding up a tablet displaying what appeared to be a screenshot of several thousand social media posts, that we smell. I'm sure that not all of them are. Callum looked at the screenshot more carefully. Some of them are saying you smell, yes. Why? Callum considered how to explain this. Human beings express feelings in ways that aren't always. We're not very good at saying we're frightened. We find it easier to be rude. The insults are a way of processing fear without having to name it as fear, because naming it as fear would mean acknowledging that we can't do anything about it. Trail looked at him with her slightly wrong-angle eyes. They call us giant purple library cards. Callum pressed his lips together very firmly. That particular one got somewhat away from me, yes? We are not purple. No, I know. The color thing is somewhat culturally specific, and I think what people are trying to express is, he stopped. Would you prefer they use a different color? Trail looked at him. That was a joke, Callum said. A poor one. I am cataloging your humor, Trail said, in a tone that made it unclear whether this was reassuring or ominous. The Vern were not purple. They were a shade that existed somewhere in the territory between gray and blue, and something that had no human name, and their skin had a faint iridescent quality that shifted under different lighting conditions, catching warmth in direct sun and going cooler in artificial light. They were approximately human-shaped, but not precisely human-proportioned. Their heads were slightly too wide, and their eyes were set at an angle that was perhaps 7 degrees off where human instinct expected them to be, which produced a persistent uncanny feeling in anyone who hadn't spent significant time with them. They were between 2.5 and 3 meters tall. Their hands had 4 fingers and a thumb, though the thumb was positioned slightly differently. And they moved with a deliberate carefulness that Callum eventually identified as habitual rather than careful, the way a large person who has spent a lifetime in spaces designed for smaller people learns to be precise about placement. They were, on every observable metric, peaceful, orderly, and genuinely baffled by human behavior in ways that ranged from mildly endearing to profoundly concerning, depending on who was being baffled and about what. Goran was the concerning one. Goran had a specific role in the Vern bureaucracy that was described as compliance facilitation, which meant he was the individual who arrived when something needed to cease happening immediately, without further discussion. He had not yet needed to do anything that technically constituted a direct threat, but he had a way of standing that seemed to communicate the full weight of the fleet sitting above the horizon. 11 ships, each large enough to contain multiple city blocks of living space, each fully equipped and crewed, and he used this quality constantly and with evident professional satisfaction. He had stood that way in the cereal aisle of the Tesco Metro on Hartley High Street when a customer had attempted to take the last box of cornflakes that a Vern administrative officer had also been reaching for, and 3 other customers had quietly returned their selections to the shelves and left the aisle without making eye contact with anyone. Briggs was different. Briggs had attached himself to Callum with the earnest, slightly overwhelming devotion of someone who has identified a project and intends to pursue it comprehensively. In the first week, Briggs had memorized the entirety of the BBC Good Food website, apparently in a systematic attempt to understand human culture through its relationship with what it ate, and could now discuss the relative merits of various approaches to preparing a roast potato with an enthusiasm and depth of knowledge that surpassed most food critics. Briggs had also developed a habit of following Callum at half a step's distance, asking questions that were entirely logical in a Vern framework and made no sense in a human one, and standing slightly too close while processing the answers. Why, Briggs asked one Tuesday morning, matching Callum's pace down the main corridor, do you have a dedicated room for consuming your midday nutrition, when you also possess a desk at which you perform your work, and the distance between the desk and the nutrition room is approximately 30 meters, and the transit time at average walking pace is 90 seconds, which represents a negligible interruption to your workflow, And the desk is not demonstrably less comfortable than the chairs in the nutrition room, and therefore the nutrition room provides no functional advantage that your desk location does not already provide. You go to the break room to get away from your desk, Callum said. But you return to the desk. Yes, so you are not, in any permanent or meaningful sense, away from it. No. Then the function of going to the break room is to feel like you've gotten away from your desk for a bit. Briggs was silent for an entire corridor length. The feeling, he said eventually, is the function. Exactly. Even though the feeling is generated by a temporary physical displacement that does not constitute actual escape from the environment or the obligations associated with that environment. That's exactly right. This, Briggs said, with the careful tone of someone making a formal methodological concession, is a thing I will not pretend to understand, but I will note it as important. That, Callum said, is the most diplomatically correct thing anyone has said to me in years. His flat was a 10-minute walk from the council building in a Victorian terrace that has been converted into 4 flats sometime in the 80s, with a narrow kitchen, a front room with excellent afternoon light, 2 bedrooms of which the second was used for storage that he had never got around to sorting. The second bedroom was now Briggs's room. The storage was in the hall, piled on the top shelf of the airing cupboard, arranged in a way that Briggs had described as suboptimal from a spatial efficiency perspective, and then reorganized during the first weekend, without asking, in a way that was objectively more efficient, but felt like a violation of something Callum couldn't fully name. Living with Briggs was manageable. That was the word Callum kept coming back to. It was manageable in the same way that a mildly flooded ground floor was manageable. Present, inconvenient, demanding ongoing attention, but not catastrophic. Briggs was quiet. Briggs did not play music. Briggs slept very little, perhaps 3 hours, and filled the remaining hours with reading, which meant that whenever Callum woke at 2 or 3 in the morning, there was a light under the study door and the faint sound of pages turning. Briggs ate almost nothing that Callum ate, consuming instead a supplement preparation that came in small sealed containers from the ship and looked like gray paste and apparently tasted fine by Vern standards. But Briggs cooked for Callum. This had started in the 2nd week and had become, by the 4th, a settled domestic arrangement. Briggs would cook, Callum would eat. They would sit at the kitchen table while Callum ate, and Briggs had his gray paste, and they would talk. The conversations were the thing Callum would find hardest to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. They were not comfortable, exactly. They were not the conversations of 2 people who understood each other, but they were genuine, and that quality, the absence of pretense, the sense of 2 people who had committed to actually trying to communicate across a gap that was, in some respects, larger than any human being had ever faced before, gave them a weight that Callum couldn't dismiss. Tell me, Briggs said, one evening, approximately 3 weeks in, over roast chicken that he had prepared with a level of technical precision that a trained chef would have found quietly humbling, why you stay, at work. In this situation, you are not required to be the liaison. You were not appointed through any formal process that carries significant authority. You remain because you choose to. I am trying to understand the basis for the choice. Callum ate a piece of chicken. Outside, it was dark, and through the kitchen window the ships were visible at the edge of the sky, lit from within, enormous and silent. I'm not sure I'm entirely comfortable with the alternative, he said. Which is? Someone who is less, I don't know, less willing to tell you when you've done something wrong. You believe you serve a protective function. I believe that if I'm not there, Goran appoints the next person, and Goran's appointments tend to prioritize compliance over communication. Briggs considered this. You believe that your presence between us and Goran's management style constitutes a meaningful protection. I hope so, Callum said. I'm genuinely not certain. That is honest. Most things I say are fairly honest. I find deception requires more sustained effort than I tend to have available. Briggs made a sound that Callum had not yet fully interpreted, a small, contained exhale that seemed to indicate something in the range of appreciation. On our world, Briggs said, honesty is considered an administrative virtue, not a personal one. It is valued in the context of accurate record-keeping and reliable reporting. The idea that honesty might be something a person simply is, constitutively, rather than something they practice in professional contexts, this is not how we think about it. What are people, constitutively, on your world? Briggs was quiet for a moment. Compliant, he said finally, with a flatness that might have been resignation, or might have been simple. Description, mostly. Is that good? It is efficient, Briggs said. We do not have the problems you have. We do not have the disagreements, and the conflicts, and the very loud arguments on the internet. But we also do not have, he paused, looking for the word, whatever the thing is that causes your species to be so thoroughly impossible to govern. I have been trying to identify it. I think it might be the same thing. Callum looked at him. The same thing as what? As whatever it is that causes you to stay. He had no answer for that. He thought about it for a long time after Briggs went to read, sitting in the kitchen with the cold remains of his tea, and he still didn't have an answer, but the question had settled into him in a way that stayed. The resistance had been operating out of the King's Head on Whitmore Street since approximately the third week of the occupation. This was Callum's fault in a way that was specific and permanent. In the first week, scrambling for anything that might delay a compliance inspection of civilian gathering spaces, he had told the Vern that public houses were sacred cultural institutions serving an essential social and communal function equivalent. He had cast around desperately for an analogy they would respect to their own administrative consultation forums. Gathering spaces where the human population processed collective emotional states, shared resources, made informal decisions about community welfare. Raiding one, he had said, with as much authority as he could project, would constitute a significant cultural offense of the first order. The Vern had, without further investigation, placed all public houses on the Protected Cultural Institutions Register and had not subsequently gone near any of them. Elodie Marsh, no relation. She said this approximately once per encounter, as preemptive statement rather than active. Clarification ran the King's Head. She was mid-30s, dark eyes, and moved with the particular economy of someone who had calculated the exact minimum number of steps required to accomplish any task and held rigidly to that calculation. She had strong opinions about the occupation, about Callum's role in it, about the adequacy of the measures he was or wasn't taking, and she delivered these opinions with the frank directness of someone who had weighed the social cost and found it acceptable. Their first real conversation had been Callum's own fault. He'd come in for a pint on a Thursday evening, 4 weeks in, looking for something that felt normal, and she'd looked at him from behind the bar with an expression that said she'd been waiting for him to come in and had been preparing what she was going to say. "You're helping them run it," she said without preamble as she set his pint down. "I'm trying to stop things from getting worse than they have to be." "That's the same thing. It really isn't. You're in the building every day. You're explaining our customs to them. You're making it easier for them to be here. I'm making it less likely that Goran decides that a fully military compliance approach is more efficient than the current administrative one." She looked at him. It was the kind of look that takes inventory. He had the distinct feeling that she was cross-referencing what he was saying against information she had already gathered about him through some other means, and finding the cross-reference instructive. "What does Wade want to do?" he asked, because he'd seen Wade in the corner, hunched over a whiteboard with 3 other people. "Come and ask him yourself," she said. Wade Connolly was a secondary school history teacher who had, apparently, been waiting without knowing it for exactly this situation. He had the quality of a person in whom extensive preparation has finally been matched with appropriate context, and the result was an almost incandescent purposefulness. He was short, energetic, and had the whiteboard habit of someone who thinks visually and trusts diagrams in a way that exceeded their actual explanatory power. He'd looked at Callum's position within the council building, the way a chess player looks at a piece that has been in a suboptimal position, and suddenly understands why it's been there all along. "You have access," Wade said. "Daily, direct, close proximity access to the administrative apparatus of an occupation that has not yet consolidated its control over its own information security. Do you understand how significant that is? I understand it theoretically. I need you to pass us information, schedules, communication patterns, access structures, not to blow anything up." He held up a hand, reading Callum's expression. "Nothing like that. To understand the architecture. The thing about bureaucrats is that their security is institutional, not physical. They rely on the structure holding. The structure holds as long as nobody outside the structure knows what the structure is. And if someone outside does know," Wade smiled, "then the structure becomes a vulnerability instead of a protection." Callum looked at the whiteboard for a long time. Then he looked at his pint. Then he looked at Wade. "If I do this and they find out," he said, "it goes badly for a lot of people. If you don't do this and we don't find a way to change the situation," Wade said, "it goes badly for everyone." He'd driven home in silence, parked outside the flat, sat in the car for 11 minutes watching the ships at the horizon. Then he'd gone in. Briggs was in the kitchen, making notes about something in a Vern script that Callum had been trying to learn and was failing at. The notes were arranged with extreme neatness on small cards. which were arranged in a grid on the table, with a logic that Callum hadn't yet deciphered. "You are making a decision," Briggs said without looking up. "I'm thinking about one. The decision will involve a degree of risk. Yes, to yourself or to others or to the current operational situation. Probably all three." Briggs set down his pen with a precise, small click. "I will not ask you to tell me what it is," he said. "I want you to know that I am aware you are managing obligations that are not entirely compatible. I am aware that your position requires you to balance things that may not be balanced. I am not," he paused, "I am not positioned to resolve that for you, but I am not unaware of it." Callum looked at him for a long moment. "Right," he said. "Thanks." "I made biscuits," Briggs said. "Digestive. The recipe is straightforward and the literature suggests they are neutral and appropriate for most circumstances." "The literature is right," Callum said, and took one. The first thing he passed to Wade was an administrative schedule, not classified under any formal security designation, but not publicly available either, the kind of internal document that was technically just a meeting timetable, but which, read correctly by someone who understood what they were looking at, told you the complete movement pattern and availability structure of every senior Vern official in the region for the following 3 months. He left it in an envelope behind the bar at the King's Head on a Wednesday evening. He ordered a pint, drank half of it, and went home. The second thing was harder because it was not incidental. He had gone looking for it. He'd been working late, the small office next to Trail's temporary headquarters, finishing a report on the queuing regulation implementation that he'd been asked to produce, and which he'd spent 3 days making as comprehensive, and therefore slow to act on, as possible. Trail had taken a communication on her personal device and stepped out of the room without securing the display. The display showed a map, the region overlaid with a grid of colored sectors. Most sectors were green, which in Vern administrative color language meant assessed as compliant and stable. Some sectors were amber, which meant attention required. Certain sectors, he counted 9, were marked in the shade that Callum had learned to associate with urgent priority. The specific word the Vern used translated, in the most accurate human equivalent, as identified for resolution. He stood and looked at it for 30 seconds. Then he moved to the door to check the corridor, came back, and began memorizing. He was systematic about it. Grid references, sector numbers, the scale bar in the corner, the date stamp in the top right. He moved through it the way he'd learned to process planning documents, from the general to the particular, the context before the detail, the structural logic before the individual items. When Trail came back 4 minutes later, he was at his own desk, typing. He wrote it down in the car park, in the dark, phone screen at minimum brightness, sitting in his car with the engine off. Every detail he could retrieve. He passed it to Hodge 3 days later. She passed it to Wade. Wade looked at it for a long time without speaking, and then said, "This is what we needed." The 9th week was when things became difficult in a new way, not because the arrangement unraveled, it did not, yet, but because Callum began to understand the full weight of what he was carrying. He was sitting in Trail's morning briefing, which he attended daily as part of his liaison function, when Trail spent 20 minutes discussing the progress of the regional integration program with 3 other senior Vern officials. The program involved, among other things, the phased relocation of certain residential populations from identified development areas. Trail described this in administrative language that was careful and measured and consistently used words like transitional and voluntary, and with appropriate consultation, and Callum listened and made notes and smiled at appropriate moments and thought, voluntary means something different in their framework than it does in ours. He thought about this on the walk home. He thought about the 9 red sectors on the map he'd memorized. He thought about Wade's whiteboard, and the plan that was building there, and the 3 groups outside the AAA that Wade was now coordinating with, and the information that had been flowing through the King's Head's back room for 5 weeks. He thought about Briggs. He understood now, managing a specific and dishonest version of himself around Briggs. The version that made conversation, learned Vern color vocabulary, ate the food Briggs prepared with evident gratitude, and genuinely found, in the evenings, something that felt almost like the comfort of known company. That version was real. But it was not the only version, and the gap between what Briggs believed he was living with and what was actually operating in the same flat, using the same kitchen, discussing empiricism and roast potatoes and the philosophical question of break rooms, that gap had a weight. He sat in the garden on a Saturday afternoon, Briggs beside him in the slightly too small garden chair that had been purchased in an emergency from the Argos in the town center, when it became clear that the existing garden furniture would not support Vern-sitting dimensions. On your world, Callum said, not quite looking at Briggs, do people have? Are there things that people know that they choose not to tell the people they live with? Briggs considered this carefully, as he considered everything. There are private professional communications that individuals are not required to share with household members, he said. Administrative confidentiality protocols. Not that. I mean personal things. Things you know about yourself or about a situation that you could tell someone and you choose not to. You mean a deliberate omission? Yes. Briggs was quiet for a moment. It is uncommon, he said, on our world. We consider transparency a structural requirement rather than a personal virtue. Omissions create inefficiencies in the information environment. And if the information is something that would change things between people, Briggs turned to look at him. Those 7-degree off eyes, catching the afternoon light, iridescent. You are asking, he said, whether I would consider a deliberate omission acceptable if the information would damage a relationship. Something like that. You are asking because you are making one. The garden was very quiet. A blackbird somewhere in the hedge behind the fence. The ships at the horizon, visible even in daylight now, a permanent feature of the sky like weather. I think you already know I am, Callum said. Briggs looked away. He was quiet for a long time, long enough for the blackbird to finish its phrase and start another. I know about the schedule, he said, the one you left on the photocopier, and I know about what came after, because I am methodical, and I noticed patterns and I was paying attention. He paused. I have been paying attention since approximately the 3rd week. Callum said nothing. I have not reported this, Briggs said, because he stopped and seemed to be working through something genuinely difficult. Because what you are doing is a form of the same thing I came here to do. You are trying to close a gap. Your method is different from mine. Your method involves significant deception, which I do not approve of. But the intent, to protect your people, to maintain a space in which something other than force is possible, this I understand. He paused. I have some sympathy for it. Briggs, that's a significant thing you're telling me. I am aware. If Goran found out you'd known, I am aware of the consequences, Briggs said, with the specific quiet of someone who has already weighed them and made a decision, and is not prepared to relitigate it. I am not asking you to thank me. I am telling you because you were going to tell me, and I preferred that you did not have to. Callum looked at his hands, then at the sky, then at Briggs, sitting in a too-small garden chair in a back garden in a town that had been renamed Territory 78, having traveled however many light years from a dying world, eating gray paste and making roast potatoes and cataloging the movement patterns of a human being who had been running an intelligence operation in the same building where the Vern had housed their regional administration and choosing not to say anything about it. The plan is going to move forward soon, Callum said. And when it does, things are going to change quickly. I understand. If you need to, if reporting something would protect you, I'm not asking you to hold back for my sake. Briggs looked at him directly. I am not holding back for your sake, he said. I am holding back because I believe that what you are attempting is, in its larger purpose, the right thing to do. And because I came here to demonstrate possibility. And I think this is the demonstration. The plan moved in the 11th week because Wade had decided the window was right. And because Goran had begun something that suggested the window would not stay right for much longer. Goran's something was subtle. It manifested first as a change in patrol patterns for the compliance drones. Their routes shifted to cover the south end of the high street, where the King's Head was, more frequently. It manifested second as a request, passed through Callum, for a census of all licensed premises on the Protected Cultural Institutions Register and the current usage data for each. It manifested third as a conversation between Goran and one of his compliance officers that Callum was not supposed to overhear, in which Goran used the phrase administrative consolidation, and a number that, when Callum had run it against the building records he knew from 7 years of planning work, corresponded to the King's Head's council property reference. He passed all of this to Wade in a single conversation in the car park behind the pub. At 11, on a Wednesday night, Wade listened without interrupting. When Callum finished, Wade nodded once, with the particular deliberateness of someone shifting from the planning phase to the execution phase, and said, "We go on Friday. That's 48 hours. That's enough." It almost wasn't. The technical operation was Hodges. Petra Hodge, who had been the council's IT systems manager for 6 years, and who had spent the first 5 weeks of the occupation running a methodical, patient, thoroughly documented assessment of every single vulnerability in the Vern's administrative network infrastructure, had prepared what she described, with characteristic understatement, as a toolkit. The toolkit allowed them to do three things: access the authentication system, broadcast over the Vern's communication network as officially verified sources, and create a log trail that would show the access as originating from the Vern's own internal systems rather than from outside. What she had designed was elegant. What it required for the initial access was a physical presence at the authentication hardware in the council building's basement. "That's me," Callum said. "That's you," Hodge confirmed. "You need to be at the server between 9:15 and 9:30 on Friday morning. That's the window when Trail's daily review occupies all senior Vern officials simultaneously. You need to plug in this drive, wait for the green light, and leave." Terrifyingly, yes, he told Briggs on Thursday evening, not the technical details, but enough. He sat down at the kitchen table after Briggs had made dinner, roast lamb, this time, because Briggs had expanded his repertoire in the preceding weeks and had developed strong opinions about lamb to rosemary ratios that he shared at some length, and he said, "Tomorrow I'm going to do something that will change things." Briggs set down his fork. "The plan has reached execution. Yes, and you need me to not be in a specific place at a specific time. I need you to be in the administrative review at 9:15 and stay in it until it's finished. That is what I will do. And I need you to know that if it goes wrong, if they trace it, I'm not going to involve you. I'm not going to tell them you knew." Briggs looked at him with those careful, tilted eyes. "I know that," he said. "I know that you would not." He paused. "I made biscuits. For after, I think, whatever after turns out to be. What kind? Digestive. They are the correct choice for uncertain circumstances." Callum almost laughed. He didn't quite. But the almost was real, and the realness of it said something that he couldn't have said directly. The basement smelled of old paper and something faintly electrical. Callum moved through it by phone light, past filing shelves that hadn't been touched since the 90s, past the emergency generator, to the section where the Vern had installed their authentication hardware. It looked like nothing significant. It looked like a domestic router, slightly oversized, matte gray. He plugged in Hodge's drive, held his breath, and waited. Amber light, blinking. He counted. His phone showed 9 minutes and 14 seconds. He thought about the planning applications on his desk, the loft conversion with the 9-centimeter ridge height issue. He thought about his mum and the kettle principle. He thought about Briggs, upstairs in the administrative review, sitting in a chair designed for Vern dimensions, not looking at the clock, demonstrating possibility, 1 minute at a time. The light went green. He pocketed the drive and took the fire exit upstairs. What happened in the 11 minutes that followed was Hodge's design and Wade's content and Elodie's edit. She had cut Wade's original draft by 40% and made every remaining sentence clearer, and it went out over the Vern's own authenticated network to 900,000 people in clear, evidenced, referenced language. What the Vern's actual 18-month implementation plan involved. The relocation provisions. The labor productivity requirements, which were exactly what they sounded like. The dietary compliance directives for year 2. Not catastrophic, not genocidal, but not what anyone had been told. Goran shut it down in 11 minutes and 20 seconds. By then it had been screenshot and forwarded and extracted to every functioning platform and could not be unbroadcast. Goran came to Callum's flat at 6 the next morning. 4 compliance officers, no drama, they waited at the door. Callum had been awake since 4. He'd made tea, drunk it, made another, not drunk it. He opened the door when they knocked. "Will you come?" Goran said, with the flatness of a formal statement. "Yes," Callum said. "Can I say goodbye to my housemate?" A pause. One of the compliance officers looked at Goran. Goran said, "You have 2 minutes." Briggs was in the kitchen. He'd been sitting at the table in the dark, which was what Vern sometimes did, simply sat in the dark, which they found restful in a way that humans generally didn't. He turned on the light when Callum came in. "They're here," Callum said. "I know. I'm going with them. I know that too." They stood in the kitchen for a moment, the two of them, in the early morning light, the untouched cup of tea on the counter, the plate of biscuits from the night before. "Tell Elodie," Callum said. "She'll know what to do." "I will tell her," Briggs said. He paused. "I will also tell Trail what I think about this situation, which may or may not be useful." Callum looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I am aware." Briggs stood up from the table. He was very tall in the kitchen, even for a Vern, the ceiling barely clearing his head, and he stood for a moment with an expression that Callum had not seen before, something that was not quite any single thing, but was closest to the look of someone who has decided something and is at peace with the decision. "You told me that Vern children spend several years watching before they are allowed to participate. You said it sounded lonely. I remember. I have been thinking about it, Briggs said. I think you were right. I think it is lonely. I think that is why I came here. He paused. I am done watching. Goran was waiting at the door. Callum went. The room on the third floor was familiar. The media meeting room, planning appeals, the two low chairs, the whiteboard, the car park view. Goran sat across from him, and the conversation was as Callum had expected. Precise, formal, and conclusive in its direction. He told the truth. When Goran asked if he had been passing information to the resistance, he said yes. When Goran asked whether he understood that this constituted a fundamental violation of his liaison function, he said yes. When Goran asked whether he had any explanation to offer, he said, I had competing obligations. I served the one that mattered most. Goran looked at him for a long time. There are things, he said, that we are going to do now. I know. You understand the scope of the response that this has triggered. I know about the resolution designation, Callum said quietly. I saw the map. Goran's expression shifted, something tightening, recalculating. You have been thorough, he said. I've tried to be. Goran stood. Remain here, he left. 20 minutes later, it was Trail who came in. She sat across from him, and for a long moment said nothing. She had that quality of sitting with full presence, of occupying a silence completely, as if the silence was also work. Briggs came to me, she said. I thought he might. He explained his position, his awareness of your activities, his decision not to report. I didn't ask him to do that. I know. He was very clear that it was his own decision. She paused. It complicates things. Briggs is valued. His judgment is considered reliable. His decision to hold this information and not act on it is the kind of thing the Council of Implementation will struggle to understand. What is the Council going to do? She looked at him steadily. That depends in part on what you give me to work with. Outside the window, the sky was the wrong color, and the ships were visible at the horizon, and Callum sat in the media meeting room on the third floor and thought about Wade's whiteboard, and Elodie's editing instinct, and Hodge's green light, and Briggs in the kitchen in the dark. I can give you the Resistance's negotiating position, he said. It's real. They're not trying to drive you off the planet. I'm not sure they believe that's achievable. They want a seat in the actual process. Genuine consultation, with genuine authority to affect outcomes. Transparency on the plans. The relocation provisions changed or eliminated. The labor requirements made voluntary in the way you told us they were, rather than voluntary in the administrative sense. That is a significant concession. From where you were standing before the broadcast, yes. From where you're standing now, he gestured at the window at the sky, it's probably the most viable option you have. Goran's resolution approach works as long as the population doesn't understand the stakes. The population now understands the stakes. Trail looked at the window, then back at him. You are asking me to argue against Goran's position to the Council. I'm asking you to consider whether his position is actually more viable than the alternative. And you believe the alternative, negotiation, consultation, shared governance, is viable. I believe it's the only thing that doesn't make the next 10 years worse for everyone. He paused. Including you. She was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that has weight and direction. Give me something, she said. Give me a formal statement from the Resistance, not a demand, a negotiating position, that I can present to the Council as an alternative to Goran's recommendation, something that demonstrates that the human population is capable of structured engagement rather than continuing escalation. Something I can show them. How long do I have? 3 hours. He called Wade from the car park. He called Elodie from the street. He called Hodge from a bench in the small park on the corner. He walked back into the building with a document that had been written by 3 people. In 40 minutes, edited by a 4th and 10, and signed by 38 and 20. It was not a surrender. It was not an appeal. It was a statement of what they would accept and what they would not, phrased in the flat administrative language of a planning document, which Callum had written because it was the only language he knew how to use with complete precision. Wade argued when Callum told him what was being asked. He made 3 good points about strategic leverage and 2 points about pride that were the same point, from different angles. Elodie listened to all of it and then said to Wade, if they use the resolution designation and we're not at the table, none of the leverage matters. She looked at Callum. What do we actually get? A process, he said. A real one. Not a liaison who performs consultation. An actual seat with actual documents and actual ability to change outcomes. And if the process breaks down, Wade's insisting on a sunset clause. If the framework fails, it reverts to 0. She thought about this for perhaps 4 seconds. All right, she said, get it done. The meeting lasted 4 hours in the medium meeting room. Trail and 2 council representatives on one side, Wade and Elodie on the other, Callum in the middle. Goran sat in for 45 minutes and then left, and his leaving changed the temperature of the room in a way that everyone noticed and no one acknowledged. Briggs had provided biscuits. This fact was noted. The biscuits were digestive. Wade made 3 arguments about the labor provisions that were, Callum privately acknowledged, extremely well-researched and clearly the product of years of structural analysis applied to a new context. Elodie said very little until the final hour, when she said one thing that changed the direction of the whole discussion. The compliance problem isn't a compliance problem. It's a communication problem. You've been explaining what you're planning and calling it consultation. We've been resisting what you're doing and calling it resistance. Neither of those things is a conversation. We're asking for a conversation. Trail looked at her for a long moment. A conversation implies both parties have the capacity to change outcomes, she said. Yes, Elodie said. That's what we're asking for. The silence that followed had the quality of something settling. The document they produced had 7 points. Point 3. No relocation without consent and compensation. Point 5. Labor provisions voluntary, transparent, with genuine opt-out. Point 6. The dietary transition program delayed 18 months, with human dietary advisors included in the planning process. Point 7, which was Elodie's, a joint cultural exchange program. 2 representatives from each side, reporting to the Joint Administrative Council. Wade's sunset clause was point 1. They signed it at 9:40 in the evening. Callum signed last. He held the pen for a moment. He thought about the couch in the break room, and the first morning, and the radio going silent. He thought about the 11 ships arriving from the east. He thought about Briggs, sitting in the dark in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, turned on the light when Callum came in. He thought about the biscuits he signed. In the corridor afterward, Trail stopped him. You were not, she said, a satisfactory liaison. No, he said. I wasn't. You were, she said, after a pause, something we did not have a category for. He walked home in the night, past the empty roads, and the weeds splitting the tarmac at the edges, and the sodium lamp outside the council building that still flickered. Past the King's Head, where the light was still on, and he could see through the window Wade and Elodie and Hodge and 3 others at the bar, not celebrating exactly, but present in the way people are when something significant has happened, and they need to be with the people it happened with. He kept walking. The kitchen light was on. Through the window, Briggs at the table, reading, a cup of something beside him, and the plate of remaining biscuits. Callum let himself in and stood for a moment in the hall, listening to the specific silence of his own flat, which was different from any other silence. He went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, got his chipped mug from the shelf. How did it go? Briggs asked without looking up from his book. We got most of what we asked for. Not all of it. No, not all of it. He made his tea, sat down across from Briggs. Point 3 through 6 are what mattered most. Wade got his sunset clause. Elodie got the cultural exchange program. I will be one of the Vern representatives, Briggs said, still reading. I have already informed Trail of this. Callum looked at him. Did she agree? She said, and I am quoting precisely, I was going to suggest you whether you wanted it or not. He turned a page. I consider this a positive outcome. Callum looked at his tea. Outside the window, the sky was still the wrong color, as it would be for a while yet. The Vern's presence in the atmosphere was doing something to the upper stratosphere that their scientists were still studying, and the correct shade of blue might be a long time coming back. The ships were still there. They would be there for a long time. The situation was not resolved. It was not fixed. It was at best reframed from a compliance problem to a conversation, which was what Elodie had said it was all along. But the frame mattered. The frame was the thing. Briggs, he said. Yes, thank you. For this morning. Briggs set down his book. He looked at Callum with the expression that Callum had learned, over these weeks, to read as something in the range of, not affection exactly, but the Vern equivalent, which was possibly something more deliberate and considered than the human version, and therefore in some ways more real. I came here, Briggs said, to demonstrate possibility. I know. I believe we have done that. I think we probably have. The biscuits were on the table between them. The kettle had finished. Outside, the ship sat in the sky, patient as they'd always been, and somewhere in the changed air there was the quality of something that was not resolution but was adjacent to it. The quality of 2 different things that had been pushed hard against each other and found, at the point of contact, that neither had broken. Callum took a biscuit, drank his tea, looked at the sky. Tomorrow there would be a framework meeting and a subcommittee on the labor provisions and a working group on the dietary transition timeline. And Wade would have 17 concerns, and Elodie would have 3 very precise ones, and Hodge would have questions about the communication infrastructure that nobody else had thought to ask. Tomorrow, the situation would continue to be complicated and unsatisfying, and full of the grinding difficulty of 2 species who had not asked to share a world trying to figure out how to share it. Tonight, there was tea. There were biscuits. There was his chipped mug. There was Briggs reading across the table, and the light in the kitchen, and the wrong-colored sky outside, and the specific ordinary, irreducible warmth of being in a place that had, against all reasonable expectation, become home. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The first joint cultural exchange session was scheduled for a Thursday, which Elodie had chosen because Thursday was historically the quietest day at the King's Head, and the King's Head was where the session was being held, and Elodie had made this decision unilaterally and informed the Joint Administrative Council after the fact. Nobody had objected. This was, Callum thought, a reasonable early indicator of how the exchange art program was going to go. He arrived 20 minutes early, because he was always 20 minutes early for things, a habit so deeply ingrained that he'd stopped noticing it except in other people's reaction to it. Elodie was behind the bar, arranging chairs into a rough circle that was geometrically imprecise in a way that felt deliberate. Human circles, as opposed to Vern circles, tended to be approximate rather than exact, and Callum had come to think this said something important about the different ways the 2 species understood the concept of gathering. How many from their side, he asked. Briggs and 1 other, someone called Ven. I can't quite get the pronunciation right, but Briggs says it's approximately correct. She moved a chair. And Wade wants to observe. I told him he could sit in the corner and be quiet. He won't be quiet. He'll try. She stood back and looked at the circle. Is it round enough? It's a circle, Callum said. More or less. More or less is probably the best we can do. This, he thought, was also a reasonable early indicator. Briggs arrived on time, which was to say 6 minutes early, because Callum had been doing his best over the preceding weeks to explain the cultural weight of punctuality, and Briggs had absorbed this information and applied it with characteristic thoroughness. The person called Vane was slightly shorter than Briggs, with the same iridescent gray-blue skin and the same slightly off angle of the eyes, and wore an expression that Callum had come to recognize as the Vern version of nervous. A very slight increase in stillness, a careful attention to body placement. Wade was in the corner with a notebook. They sat in the circle. 8 people, 4 from each side, and 2 species, and the slightly too low chairs, and the Thursday afternoon light coming through the King's Head windows at an angle that was, Callum noticed, the ordinary right color, the ordinary unshifted blue of a September afternoon in northern England, which had been coming back slowly, in patches, the way the world always recovers from things, unevenly, by degrees, without announcement. The exchange program's stated purpose was cultural understanding. Its actual purpose, or at least its additional, unstated purpose, which everyone in the room understood but nobody mentioned, was to create a space where 2 groups of people who had spent 11 weeks finding ways to be adversaries could learn to be something more complicated than that, without having to call it reconciliation, because reconciliation implied that everything had been resolved, and nothing had been resolved, and they were all old enough to know the difference. Callum had prepared a short presentation about the significance of tea, which he gave to mixed response. Briggs was attentive and kept nodding. Vane appeared genuinely interested. Wade made a note. Elodie seemed to be concealing amusement. Briggs had prepared nothing, but spoke for 20 minutes on the Vern concept of VethRL, which was approximately translated as the obligation of the competent to explain themselves clearly to those who are trying to understand, and which had no human equivalent, but prompted a 20-minute conversation that was the most productive thing that had happened in the building in 11 weeks. Elodie talked about the pub, what it was for, what it meant, the particular function of a space where you could be in public without being required to be anything specific. Not productive, not compliant, not representative of any position or allegiance, just present. Vane asked carefully whether all human social spaces had this quality. The good ones, Elodie said. What makes a good one? She thought about this. One where you feel like you can say something true and not be punished for it. Vane looked at her, then at Briggs, then at Callum. On our world, Vane said slowly, we do not have spaces like that. I know, Briggs said quietly. I know we don't. That was the moment. Not the signing of the framework, not the 4-hour negotiation, not the broadcast or the basement or anything that Callum had done or not done. This was the moment. Briggs sitting in a circle in a pub on a Thursday afternoon, saying, "I know we don't," with the specific weight of someone who has understood something new about the world they came from and the world they're trying to make. Callum looked at the wrong-colored sky through the King's Head window. It was right today. The blue was right. It had come back incrementally over the past 2 weeks as the Verne scientists adjusted something in the atmospheric systems, not because anyone had asked them to, and not because it appeared anywhere in the framework document, but because Briggs had read a paper about atmospheric light refraction and the human psychological response to color temperature, and had written a memo, and Trail had acted on it. The memo had taken 40 minutes to write. It had not been part of any negotiation. It had been one individual, working in a new world, doing the thing that seemed like it needed doing. This was also, Callum thought, a reasonable early indicator. The framework meeting that week had produced a subcommittee on the dietary transition timeline, a working group on the communication infrastructure, and a preliminary agreement on the first 3 relocation consultation sessions. The first consultation session was scheduled for the following Monday. Wade had 17 concerns about it, which he had prepared in a written document, cross-referenced to the relevant framework points, with a covering note that said he was not trying to be difficult, and a subsequent paragraph that was, Callum thought, a little bit trying to be difficult. Elodie had 3 concerns, all of them precise, all of them about the consent mechanism, and she had already spoken to Trail about all 3 and received what she described as a reasonably satisfactory response. Hodge had questions about the communication infrastructure that nobody else had thought to ask, concerning the specific way the Verne's network architecture would interact with the remaining human internet infrastructure during the 3-year integration period. And she had been talking to a Verne engineer, called something that sounded approximately like Marin, for 2 weeks, and the conversation had been going well. Goran had been reassigned to a different territory. No one had told Callum this officially. He had found out through Briggs, who had mentioned it in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening, as a piece of administrative information, in the same tone he used to mention anything else. Neutral, precise, clearly aware of its weight. "Is he coming back?" Callum had asked. "No," Briggs said. "I believe the council considers his approach to have been suboptimal given the outcome." "Right. I also believe that his departure was in part a result of Trail's assessment, which was influenced by a number of factors, including Vane's report on the exchange program." Vane wrote a report? Vane writes reports on everything. It is how Vane processes experience. In this respect, Vane is very Verne. He paused. The report was positive. I'm glad. The report included a section on the concept of spaces where one can say something true without punishment. This section was quoted at some length. Callum looked at his tea. "Elodie will be pleased to know that. I thought it would be appropriate to tell her directly," Briggs said. "I will do that. Perhaps on Thursday." The Thursday sessions became a fixture. Not always the same 8 people, not always the same topics, but something that had the quality of continuity, the thing that shows up regularly, becomes part of the week's structure, accumulates small weight over time. Callum did not know whether the exchange program would change anything on a larger scale. He suspected that whether it did would depend on things beyond this room, this town, this territory, and probably beyond his ability to affect. The ships were still in the sky. The administrative framework was still new and fragile, and full of the pressure of 2 species that had not yet learned to trust each other's intentions. The situation was not resolved. It was in process. But on Thursday afternoons, in the King's Head, in chairs arranged in an approximate circle, 2 groups of people who had every reason to be adversaries were choosing, week by week, to be something else instead. Not friends, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but something. Something that required showing up and trying, and occasionally saying things that were uncomfortable and true, and occasionally eating biscuits, and occasionally sitting with the ordinary difficulty of understanding each other and not pretending it was easy. This was, Callum thought, the most human thing he could think of. Not the cleverness, not the resilience, not the stubborn refusal to cooperate with orderly subjugation, though all of those things had mattered. What mattered now was this: the willingness to keep trying, imperfectly, with incomplete information, without any guarantee of outcome. He made his tea. He sat at the table. He looked at the right-colored sky. Tomorrow there would be a working group and a subcommittee, and 17 of Wade's concerns, and 3 of Elodie, S. and Hodge's questions about network architecture, and the Monday consultation session, and all of it, all the grinding daily work of making something real out of something that had started as a projection on a cloud layer. He was 31 years old. He He had a planning application on his desk about a loft conversion with a 9-centimeter ridge height issue that he genuinely intended to resolve this week. He had an alien living in his spare room who had opinions about roast potatoes and the nature of empiricism and the importance of spaces where you could say things that were true. He had nowhere else to be, and for the first time in 11 weeks, he was grateful for it. That was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough. There were things about the occupation that Callum had not expected, and most of them were small. He had expected disruption. He had not expected that the disruption would manifest primarily as administrative confusion rather than physical destruction. The Vern had not bombed anything. They had not demolished buildings or rerouted rivers or done any of the things that science fiction had primed him to expect from a conquering alien force. What they had done was impose a comprehensive administrative reorganization on basically everything. And the effect of this was a kind of grinding dislocation that wore at people in ways that outright destruction might not have. You could clear rubble. It was harder to know what to do when your street was technically fine, but the designation of the land it sat on had been reclassified, and your job had been absorbed into a Vern administrative function you couldn't apply for, and the thing you used to eat on Tuesdays was now subject to a dietary review that would conclude in 18 months. He had expected fear. He had not expected that fear would coexist, in most people, with a peculiar and persistent pragmatism. The shops had reopened. The schools had reopened after 3 weeks with adjusted curricula that Callum had seen previewed in a Vern administrative document and had spent 2 days drafting very careful feedback on, feedback which had been received and partially incorporated. The football had resumed. The pubs were open. People adapted because the alternative to adapting was simply not functioning, and most people could not sustain not functioning for very long. He had expected that the aliens would be alien in a way that was clean and comprehensible. He had not expected Briggs. Briggs, it turned out, had a sense of humor, not a human sense of humor. The things Briggs found funny were often not the things Callum found funny, and the things Callum found funny were often baffling to Briggs. But Briggs had the capacity for it, for the particular kind of laughter that comes from recognizing the gap between how things are supposed to work and how they actually do. Callum was starting to think possibly universal, possibly every species that had ever evolved enough to build things and run out of resources and worry about the future had also evolved the capacity to laugh at the gap between intention and outcome, because the alternative was despair, and despair was not productive. Briggs's current favorite comedic observation was that the Vern had, in designing their administrative framework for Earth's occupation, made a fundamental error. They had studied human administrative systems for 200 years, and they had learned a great deal about how those systems were supposed to work. They had not adequately accounted for the gap between how human administrative systems were supposed to work and how they actually worked in practice, which was a gap of significant and historically consistent magnitude. "Your planning permission system," Briggs said one evening, reading the loft conversion application that Callum had finally brought home because he felt, in a slightly irrational way, that it deserved resolution, requires an application to be assessed against a set of criteria, and a decision to be issued within 8 weeks, and this decision may be appealed within 6 months. The appeal is assessed by a different body, and the assessment of the appeal is subject to further review in certain circumstances. "That's right," Callum said. "In the cases I have reviewed, the average time from initial application to final resolution, including all appeals and reviews, is 4 years and 3 months. That sounds about right. The system is designed to take 8 weeks. It takes 4 years. Yes. How?" Callum thought about this. Each individual step takes approximately the amount of time it's supposed to, but the steps accumulate. And then there are additional steps that weren't in the original design that have accreted over time because of specific problems or legal challenges, and those steps also take time, and the interaction between all the steps creates. He paused. Complexity. Complexity, Briggs repeated. It's not a bad system. It's just a system that's been in operation for a long time in a context that keeps changing, and it's adapted to the changes in ways that preserve the original structure while adding to it, and the result is something that still more or less works but takes considerably longer than the design specified. Briggs looked at him for a long moment. "We designed our administrative integration framework," he said carefully, "on the basis of your systems as documented. Right, we anticipated a compliance timeline of 36 months. Right. You are suggesting," Briggs said, "that this timeline may be optimistic." Callum picked up his tea. I would not like to speculate on the specific revision required, he said, but I would say that 36 months represents an understanding of the design, rather than of the practice. Briggs looked at the loft conversion application. He looked at the photograph of the proposed dormer window. He looked at the 9-centimeter ridge height discrepancy that had been noted in red pen on the site plan. Then he made the sound that Callum had learned was the Verne equivalent of laughing, the small, precise exhale, and said, I will need to update my projections. The loft conversion Callum resolved the following Tuesday. The ridge height was an issue, but the applicant had submitted a revised design with a reduced pitch that brought the measurement within permitted development limits. He approved it. It was the first planning application he had processed since the ships arrived, and he felt a disproportionate satisfaction about this, which he mentioned to no one. He had also, in the week since the framework signing, been doing something he hadn't quite named to himself. He had been watching the sky, not the ships. The ships were simply there, permanently, a feature of the landscape that he'd stopped consciously registering. In the same way you stop consciously registering a mountain range you can see from your kitchen window. He was watching the color, the specific shade of blue, which had been wrong since the first day, and which was, by imperceptible degrees, becoming right again. It was not a dramatic change. It was not visible from day to day or even week to week. But over the months, there was movement, a tone returning. The ordinary blue of northern England, which was a specific thing, grayer than the south, cooler, with a quality of depth, coming back one atmospheric layer at a time. Briggs had explained the technical process. The Verne's ships emitted trace compounds during operation, compounds that were inert biologically, but which had subtle effects on the upper atmosphere's light-scattering properties. Adjusting the compound mixture was straightforward. Briggs had simply written a memo. You wrote a memo, Callum had said when Briggs told him. I read the paper on color temperature and human psychological response, Briggs said. The effect on mood regulation appeared significant. The adjustment was simple. It seemed correct to make it. It wasn't part of the framework. No, but it was the right thing to do. There it was again. The phrase that made everything harder and also everything clearer. Callum had been noticing, over the past weeks, that Briggs used it in a very specific way, not as a claim about universal moral law or abstract principle, but as a practical assessment of a specific situation. The right thing to do meant the thing that, when you looked at all the available information about what was happening and what was likely to happen, seemed most likely to move toward outcomes that were better rather than worse for everyone involved. It was, he thought, how he tried to use the phrase too, though he was less systematic about it. He had also been noticing that Briggs had changed. This was harder to describe precisely. Briggs was still Briggs, still methodical, still thorough, still prone to questions about break rooms and the logical basis for human emotional customs. But there was a quality in him that had not been there in the first weeks, a quality that Callum associated with someone who had been watching from outside for a long time, and had finally stepped through the door, not settled exactly, not comfortable, but present in a fuller way, engaged with the specific texture of things rather than the administrative summary of them. He was reading differently, too. In the first weeks, Briggs had been reading systematically, working through the BBC recipe archive, the Wikipedia articles on British cultural institutions, the history of local government. Now he was reading more idiosyncratically, following threads rather than curricula, the way someone reads when they're genuinely interested rather than when they're researching. He'd spent a week on late-night radio broadcasts from the 50s and 60s, listening to recordings that Callum's mother's generation had listened to as children. He'd spent 4 days on the oral history project that Hartley Community College had run in 2015, interviewing local residents about what the town had been like in the post-war period. He'd come to Callum one morning with a printed copy of a letter written by a former council employee in 1962 protesting the demolition of a Victorian market hall to make way for a car park, and asked Callum to explain why the letter had not been effective, because the decision had already been made by the time it was written, Callum said, and the person making the decision didn't value the same things the letter writer valued. The market hall was demolished, yes, and the car park is still there. Briggs had looked at the letter for a long time. I think, he said carefully, that there are things about your species that we did not understand, that I still do not fully understand. The letter writer knew that the letter would not be effective. They wrote it anyway. Yes, why? Callum thought about this. Because the record mattered. Because saying it, even to an audience that wasn't going to listen, was still saying it. Because sometimes the point isn't to change the immediate outcome. It's to be able to say that when this moment happened, you said what you thought was true. Briggs was quiet for a long time. Then, I would like to understand this better. I don't know that it gets more understandable, Callum said. I think it's one of those things that you either feel the weight of or you don't, and I'm not sure it's something you can reason your way into, but you feel it. Yes, and it informs your decisions, a lot of my decisions, yes. Briggs looked at the letter. I came here, he said, with a 200-year observational record, and I still did not know about this. No, Callum said. You wouldn't. It doesn't show up in official records. This was the thing, he thought later. The thing that the Verne's 200 years of observation had not captured and could not have captured. The texture of it. The specific weight of a letter written to an audience that wasn't going to listen, by someone who wrote it anyway because the record mattered. The chipped mug. The break room logic. The way his mom put the kettle on when things went wrong. The specific quality of a Thursday afternoon in the King's Head when 8 people were trying. You couldn't observe any of that from a ship. You had to be in it. The relocation consultation sessions were harder than the framework negotiations had been because the negotiations had been between a small number of people with the authority to agree to things, and the consultations involved actual residents of actual streets who had been informed that the land their houses sat on had been assessed as a development area. The first session had 47 attendees and lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes, and at the end of it, nothing had been resolved, except that everyone now understood more precisely what was being proposed and why, and what the objections were. Callum had facilitated. This was, he had discovered, his actual skill, not the planning expertise or the administrative knowledge, though both were useful, but the capacity to sit in a room full of people who were frightened and angry and talking past each other, and find structure underneath the noise. It was what he'd been doing all along, he thought. With the Verne, with Wade, with the framework, finding the structure underneath the noise, and naming it clearly enough that people could see it. The second consultation session had 63 attendees and lasted 4 hours. A Verne urban planning official attended, accompanied by Briggs as interpreter, not of language, which the universal translation systems handled adequately, but of context, which they didn't. Briggs had been quietly learning the specific history of each street that was under consideration for development, not from the Verne's survey data, but from the Community College Oral History Archive and the local newspaper's online archive, and 3 conversations with a retired school teacher who lived on one of the streets and had been there for 40 years. At a critical moment in the session, when the Verne planning official was explaining the development rationale in terms of infrastructure capacity and population management, and 3 residents were talking over him and each other in increasing volume, Briggs had said, simply and clearly, 40 years ago, the family who lives next door to Mrs. Fernandez built the fence between their properties together on a Saturday morning, and Mrs. Fernandez's husband, who died in 2019, used to check on their daughter when they were away. The street is not a data point. The street is 40 years of this. The room went quiet. The Verne planning official looked at Briggs, then at Mrs. Fernandez, then at the data on his tablet, which contained many precise measurements and no information about fences built on Saturday mornings. He did not reverse the development designation that day, but he requested a delay to the consultation timeline to conduct what he called a revised impact assessment, and the delay was approved by the Administrative Council, and the revised assessment included a new section that had not existed before on what the documentation called community, social infrastructure, and what Callum called, in his own mind, the texture of things. Mrs. Fernandez had thanked Briggs afterward. She'd shaken his hand, which was a gesture the Verne did not have, and he'd let her and held her hand for a moment in both of his with the careful, thorough attention he brought to everything. This was not, Callum thought, what anyone had expected when the ships arrived. The expected thing was conflict or submission or some combination of the two, the narrative that every film and every book and every half-awake imagining of first contact had suggested. Not this. Not the slow, grinding, imperfect work of 2 species trying to understand each other well enough to share a planet, with all the frustration and miscommunication and occasional small grace that the work required. Not Briggs, sitting with Mrs. Fernandez's hand in both of his, having spent 3 weeks learning the history of a single street so that he could say one true thing at the right moment. Not Wade, who had 17 concerns and also, Callum had recently learned, had been invited to teach a module at the University of Lancaster on human-alien civic relations, and was preparing the syllabus with the same thoroughness he brought to everything else. Not Elodie, who was currently in negotiation with the Vern Administrative Council about converting the King's Head's back room into a permanent community consultation space, and who had presented a proposal that was, Callum had been shown a draft, the most well-argued planning document he had read in his professional life, not Hodge, who was in daily conversation with the Vern engineer called Marin about the communications infrastructure, and who had recently sent Callum a message at 11 at night saying simply, "Did you know the Vern have had internet for 600 years and it still goes down in the rain?" I find this deeply reassuring. None of this was what anyone had expected. But this was what it was, and what it continued to be, and what Callum showed up for every morning. The chipped mug, the wrong-colored sky slowly becoming right, the planning applications, the consultations, the Thursday sessions at the King's Head, the small daily work of finding the structure underneath the noise. He was 31 years old. He had nowhere else to be. He was glad of it.